graphic novel about three cousins who are lost and trying to find their way home. On their way, they meet plenty of friends in the form of a princess named Thorn, an old warrior, Grandma Ben, and the townsfolk of the valley. They also meet plenty of enemies as the rat creatures and their leader King Doc. This story is a timeless, epic story involving dragons, magic, and emotional depth you wouldn't assume a cartoon comic like this could have. This is the story of the crazy passion project Bone by Jeff Smith. Jeff had many influences when he was a kid. He read comic strips like Pogo, The Peanuts, and watched cartoons like Looney Tunes and read books like Lord of the Rings. These stories and cartoon characters seeped into his life, and when he was at the age of 5, he started making his own drawings of the bone creatures. He had been periodically drawing these creatures, and he eventually went to Ohio State University in 1982, and ended up drawing his first version of Bone in the form of Thorn Tales from the Lantern in the school newspaper. Only 1,000 copies were produced of this comic, but once he had gotten a taste of making Thorn Tales from the Lantern, he wanted to continue with the characters he's created so far. At this time, in 1986, Jeff had founded an animation studio with two friends of his, Jem Camerad and Marty Fuller, and the studio was called the Character Builders Animation Studio. He created a lot of ads and eventually also helped with the cartoons in Space Jam and a handful of Disney animated sequels like 101 Dalmatians 2, Little Mermaid 2, and Tarzan 2. So Jeff had a lot of experience with drawing cartoon characters, but still was attached to having a realistic story and didn't want to write a children's book. In a documentary called The Cartoonist, Jeff Smith, Bone, and the Changing Face of Comics, Jeff states that in the 90s, comic book stores were full of grown men, as opposed to children. He believed the comics were generally targeted towards adults and older teens, and also around this time, the mid to late 1980s, there were releases such as Watchmen, Mouse, and The Dark Knight Returns. And each of these books, I think, helps Jeff's statement from earlier in that comics were not targeting children, but now making books at a level of maturity that would be too complex for a young reader, and something that wouldn't necessarily catch their attention. Jeff had heard about underground comics, and this idea of self-publishing really got his gears turning. He wasn't sure how well his book would sell, though. He was concerned with the story not being a stereotypical comic book, as he puts it, with the constant meanwhile box in the top corner and switching locations every panel, with tons of exposition and explosive action scenes. This meant to him it wouldn't sell because it wouldn't be anything different than what's already being put on the shelves. Jeff didn't really want this. He wanted to tell a denser story that will leave you satisfied and linger in your mind after you've read it. And once he got his hands on The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, he realized that this was the change that he needed. The Dark Knight Returns and other novels around this time changed the story structure of comic books and turned them into actual stories that could be artistically and commercially viable, as he puts it. This was Jeff's window of opportunity to release his book. So in 1991, Jeff decided to leave the animation studio to put all of his effort into creating Bone. His wife, Vijaya Ayer, rarely encouraged him not to do this, that he was literally gambling everything on this comic book, and at the time, comic books weren't a reliable source of income. Not that they are today. But she wanted him to just take a year off of the animating instead of completely dropping it. But Jeff was sure that this would work. He had complete faith in his project, so Jeff left the animation studio to go create his own publishing company, with which he called Smith's Cartoon Books. The first issue of Bone was then released in June of 1991, and sold less than 2,000 copies. Jeff and Vijaya were a little nervous, but continued to power through the next couple issues. And by issue 6, sales were up immensely and reviews were pouring in about this new series titled Bone. People were saying things like it was funny, charming, and had great storytelling, and was walking in the tradition of George Harriman and Walt Kelly, which I can only imagine how this made Jeff feel, comparing his work to his inspiration and something he loved as a kid. Jeff then, after seeing the success of his book and the love the audience had for it, continued to work. And work he did through 14 years and working at least 6 days a week, about 20 hours a day sometimes. His hard work shows in the Bone series with this example I have on screen, where Jeff was basically drawing the same panel over and over again with slight iterations from before. This was used to stretch out time and give us more time with the characters such as the villains, the rat creatures. They have fallen out of line with their leader King Dog because they failed to catch the bone creature they are searching for, and this scene right here is where they are hiding in a hollow talking about getting some food because they haven't eaten for a couple hours. It's just a little scene that could have taken up only one panel, but Jeff decides to stretch it out into 4 pages. This is a tactic that has been used in many comics, and one that comes to mind is Watchmen and the more recent Mr. Miracle. I love it when artists choose to do this. But shortly after completing his masterpiece, he was approached by Scholastic about another publishing deal. They did not want to change his book or make it more child-friendly or anything like that. Their recommendation was to add color and publish the book themselves. Jeff was initially skeptical about this idea, and he was a little taken aback because he had created Bone to be black and white. And then his friend Art Spiegelman approached him about this, and Jeff explained how he felt and all the effort he put into making it black and white and how it wasn't going to be the same once it was colored. Jeff used Spiegelman's mouse as an argument of why don't they color that one? And Spiegelman responded and said that Mouse is a story about survival and death, and not something happy like life. Bone is a story about friends, and he believed that this story would benefit from having color and would make the characters feel even more alive than they already are. This convinced Jeff, and so him and Vijaya accepted Scholastic's offer, and the books were then colored by colorist Steve Hamaker. Bone is a very impressive graphic novel, and I think it is a rare novel that can be reached by anyone who chooses to read it, no matter where they come from or how old they are. Jeff quit his job, created a publishing company, wrote, drew, and worked his butt off to make sure he could put his passion project to paper. Though Jeff isn't the only writer-artist to create an epic through pictures and words, I do believe his will stand the test of time.